Well, right now, Iran flexing its military muscle. State television showing the unveiling of a new ballistic missile. That missile reportedly has a range of 300 miles and features more advanced electronics and targeting systems. A U.S. defense official telling Fox News the missile is the real thing and not just propaganda. This, of course, in the wake of the nuclear deal with Iran and some question marks on where it goes from here. Also happening over the weekend, Great Britain reopening its embassy in Tehran, the move potentially paving the way for more relations between the two countries. Now, this is 4 years after protesters stormed that compound, destroying it and threatening the safety of its diplomats and their families. The Brits evacuated its team, shut down the embassy again 4 years ago, and here we are today. Let's bring in Niall Gardner, a former aide to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Niall, I'm curious what you think about this move by the Brits. Why now?
Well, I think it's absolutely appalling, actually, the reopening of the British Embassy in Tehran 4 years after it was trashed by a mob acting at the behest of the Iranian regime, an act of barbarism and thuggery. And add insult to injury, of course, the British have had to pay the cost of repairing that embassy, stretching to several £100,000. And I think this sends really the wrong signals to the Iranian regime. It's another act of appeasement towards Tehran. And this whole idea that you can have some kind of friendly, normal relationship with the mullahs controlling the Iranian regime is an absolute fantasy, and it's very sad to see the British government falling for this trap.
The British ambassador to the United States was a guest on our program a few weeks ago because we heard murmurs that perhaps this would happen, that the Brits would reopen their embassy by the end of the year. We had no idea the timeline was quite as quick. Again, speaking to the British ambassador, I asked him the question about nuclear deal and legitimizing the regime in Iran before we actually knew if the deal was going to take place. Here's what he told us about why he thought it was important.
I think the idea of getting our embassy open makes perfectly good sense as long as we can do it on terms which are in conformity with international agreements and with our own national security interests and so on. And we'd like, therefore, to be able to talk to the Iranians about a lot of different subjects, not just the Iranian issue, the nuclear issue, on which we do think we've got an agreement which blocks the path to nuclear weapons.
What potentially are the other issues that he's speaking about, Niall?
Well, I think that certainly the British government is looking for enhanced trade relations with the Iranian regime. After all, there's been a flood of European politicians, dignitaries heading over to Tehran in recent weeks following the Iran nuclear deal. I do think it's very important that Britain puts principle ahead of financial interests here. Let's not forget that the Iranians are responsible for the killing of more than 100 British soldiers in Iraq through their support for Iranian-backed militias. They have British and American blood on their hands. Iran remains the world's biggest state sponsor of international terrorism. The idea that you can embark upon some kind of cordial relationship with this kind of evil, barbaric and brutal regime, I think is a huge mistake for the British to take at this time.
As of right now, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader in Iran, hasn't come out and supported the nuclear deal. We know that it's also the nuclear deal working its way through Congress. And there is a question mark about whether or not lawmakers do approve this in its finality. Niall, I'm curious, because we're such great allies with Britain, what you think the move by the British government does to the United States position and some of the questions that Americans still have about this nuclear deal.
Certainly, I think that it's probably President Obama's intention to eventually open a U.S. embassy in Tehran. So from Obama's point of view, this is a helpful development. I do think it's very bad, though, for British interests, and it's very bad for U.S. interests as well, when you have both the U.S. and British governments, in effect, appeasing the Iranian regime. It's very unfortunate that there is no vote being held in the House of Commons over the Iran nuclear deal, because I understand that quite a few MPs, members of the British Parliament, are opposed to this deal. So there is some strong domestic opposition to this deal, and I think that David Cameron has not been listening at all to British domestic critics of what is an extremely dangerous and bad deal for Britain and for the United States and for the free world.
That brings up such interesting questions, though, about what actually happened inside the negotiations and what roles were being played by the different sides of the parties that were privy there. It's interesting, Niall, to note that there are, obviously the president is very out, the United States president is very out in front in support of this deal, and yet there are questions from both sides of the aisle and from the American public about it. And from what you say, that's the same thing that we're seeing in Britain as well. Even if people don't have their minds made up completely, there are still questions. So what does it say to you that the leaders of our great countries are so confident about moving ahead when still so many questions remain?
I think it's highly unfortunate that both David Cameron and Barack Obama are pushing this poisonous deal. This is a deal that would have been fundamentally rejected by Margaret Thatcher if she were Prime Minister today. She would have handbagged this deal and described it as a betrayal of British interests. This is a deal that is going to enhance Iran's power. It's going to strengthen Iran's position as the world's leading state sponsor of international terrorism. It's inevitably, I think, going to lead to a nuclear-armed Iran. This is a deal that is being drawn up with a regime that simply cannot be trusted, a regime that is absolutely unscrupulous, that is thoroughly evil, in my opinion. And it's a deal that I think the vast majority of Americans oppose, actually, as opinion poll after opinion poll has showed, and also a clear majority of the United States Congress is against this deal. And I do think that President Obama and David Cameron here are throwing their own countries under the bus with an absolutely appalling agreement with Iran.
It's interesting to see a commonality of the people who voted to put these leaders in office having some remaining questions, but those leaders being so strongly in favor of moving ahead regardless. It's something we're going to continue to watch, and of course we'll watch the security and what happens at the embassy in Tehran that the British government just reopened. Now, great to have you in the program. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
My pleasure.